Good morning, everybody. I call to order this subcommittee's third hearing on cybersecurity. With the growing reliance on the global economy for our goods and services, we are faced with the challenge that ensuring the security of those items has become even more difficult. As the global economy grows, so does the complexity of the global supply chain. The U.S. government is increasingly reliant on commercially available products for information technology, IT services, and components. This reliance forces the U.S. government to depend on the trustworthiness of the global commercial supply chain. Cyber or state-sponsored actors are capable of secretly inserting malicious code into both hardware and software during the manufacture of those items. Let me give you some specific examples. In July 2010, Dell announced that some of its PowerEdge motherboards contained malicious spyware that gathered information about a victim's internet browsing habits and collected personally identifiable information. During a security conference in May 2010, IBM gave complimentary USB drives to attendees that contained two kinds of malware, including a keylogger program. In March 2010, Spanish cell phone company Vodafone released a new version of a popular smartphone infected with a version of the Butterfly botnet in addition to other malicious software. These, my colleagues, and many other instances of supply chain poisoning are capable of causing damage to, allowing a cyber criminal unauthorized access to, or allowing the exfiltration of sensitive or personally identifiable information from a victim's computer system. Now, last week, the Government Accounting Office released a report examining the risks and threats to the supply chains of both commercial and federal IT systems. The GAO studied 4 agencies involved in national security: Department of Defense, Energy, Homeland Security, and Justice, and their ability to access the risks to their own IT supply chains and the steps they have taken to mitigate them. We have joined by the GAO today to discuss their findings and recommendations. While DOD and DOE and DHS and Justice each participated in interagency efforts to address supply chain security, some of these agencies have been more progressive than others in addressing IT supply chain security risk. In particular, I was troubled to find that the GAO concluded that the Department of Energy had not developed clear policies that define what security measures are needed to protect against supply chain threats. Clearly defined security measures with comprehensive implementing procedures are necessary and vital to the protection of federal IT. One additional comment about the report as a whole is that there appears to be no integrated response amongst the federal IT enterprise to address supply chain risks. Agencies are left to their own devices to address this risky and complex threat. I find this very troubling. Today we will hear testimony from 2 panels of witnesses. On our first panel, we're joined by Mr. Gregory Wichtelson, Director of Information Security Issues at GAO, and his staff who assisted in drafting this report. We're also joined by representatives of 2 agencies who are the subject of the report, Mr. Mitchell Komarov, Director of the Trusted Mission Systems Network at the Department of Defense, and Mr. Gil Vega, Associate CIO for Security and Chief Information Security Officer at the Department of Energy. I look forward to their testimony and getting a much better understanding of the work they do to ensure the integrity of their agency's IT supply chain. I also want to welcome our second panel of witnesses who will provide us with an overview of the private sector approach to identifying IT supply chain risk and using industry's best practices to mitigate them. We're joined by Mr. Larry Castro, Managing Director at the Chertoff Group and former National Security Agency, Central Security Services, representative to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Also joining us is Dave Lonsberry, Chief Technological Officer at the Open Group and International IT Standards Board. We welcome all of the second panel also. As I mentioned previously, this is the subcommittee's third hearing in this Congress on cybersecurity. The purpose of this hearing in particular is to understand the threats and vulnerability to federal IT supply chains and how best to ensure their integrity. I've enjoyed working with a ranking member on this matter and the minority in particular, and look forward to our continuing cooperation on cybersecurity issues. And I yield to distinguished ranking member, Mr. Gett from Colorado.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I also appreciate the work that you've done on this issue and working with the minority. Ensuring the integrity of our information technology supply chain is critical to protecting our federal systems against terrorists, counterfeiters, hackers, and other enemies. In 1997, the Government Accountability Office made government-wide information security part of its biannual high-risk series. Since then, the government, like the private sector, has become more and more technology dependent and more reliant on private sector hardware and software. Just to think of one example, think about all the census work 2 years ago. What used to be collected versus pad and paper is now collected and transmitted electronically. And with every new technology, our nation's infrastructure becomes more exposed to new threats and vulnerabilities. As more components are manufactured outside of this country, our technology systems become more vulnerable to infiltration by our foreign enemies. A few malicious lines of software code, cleverly hidden in a larger program, counterfeit hardware or software, and even malicious or unqualified service providers all present risk to the technology that drives our supply chain. In January of this year, President Obama launched the National Strategy for Global Supply Chain Security. I commend the President for taking supply chain issues seriously, but we as Congress also have an important role to play in ensuring the security and safety of these systems. Last month, as the chairman mentioned, this subcommittee held a hearing on cybersecurity threats to our electric grid. During that hearing, I asked our witnesses about the potential risk to the supply chain associated with devices connected to the grid. Richard Campbell, testifying on behalf of the Congressional Research Service, agreed if the wrong people were able to gain improper access to these devices, they could do any number of dangerous things, including implanting a software bug in a smart meter's firmware and control its functions and the functions of the devices attached to it. A meter could be set, for example, to control the thermostat for a room containing servers, and a hacker could increase the temperature to destroy the servers. We know that counterfeit circuitry can cause critical devices or systems to malfunction. Logic bombs can be inserted into devices. These are systems that will lie dormant until a device engages in a certain activity, at which point they can overtake the device and any system associated with it. Our federal government, including the military and the Department of Homeland Security, is heavily reliant on the private sector to provide these devices and to vet them to ensure they are safe and secure. GAO's findings suggest that some of the agencies, like the Department of Defense, are on the right track to safeguarding their information systems from external threats. But other agencies, like the Department of Energy, still need to define supply line chain protection measures and develop implementing procedures and monitoring capabilities. However, this isn't just an issue for federal agencies. Private companies also struggle to develop plans to prevent and respond to supply chain disruptions. That is why I'm pleased to have the second panel here today to talk about how the private sector is addressing these issues. I look forward to learning how about the threats and vulnerabilities they see in the hardware and the software systems companies purchase and sell, and also what private companies are doing to ensure the products they provide to their customers are protected. In the cybersecurity context, we know that companies are not required to report these threats and vulnerabilities to the federal government, and we are aware that in certain instances companies have chosen not to do so, leaving federal agencies in the dark about how widespread a problem is or whether it's been resolved. We need to hold everybody accountable for ensuring that our supply chain is safe, and that starts with ensuring that those who build and sell key supply chain hardware and software components are properly safeguarding their devices from threats. We must find ways to ensure that U.S. suppliers are responsible for the security of their foreign-made devices and systems. We must make sure that manufacturers are reporting threats, vulnerabilities, and cyber attacks quickly so that the government and the private sector can take appropriate actions. And finally, we must make sure that the federal government is carefully vetting the information technology products they purchase. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to hearing from both of the panels about what work we can do to ensure our federal technologies are as secure as possible, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, gentlelady. Recognize Mr. Murphy. Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for her opening statement.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. On December 11, 1941, despite some warnings of what was to come, And despite seeing clear planes flying towards Pearl Harbor, we slept. But as the Korean War started, an intelligence lapse also meant that South Korea was overwhelmed. And when the Marine barracks in Lebanon were bombed, it occurred in the midst of dozens, perhaps hundreds of warnings that something was about to occur. We are now facing similar threats in the area of cybersecurity, and it is important that we do not sleep as this dawn is upon us. When we look at a measure of cybersecurity, such things as resilience, an ability to send out alert, defending against an attack, being able to launch a counterattack and recover from an attack, unfortunately, many of the sectors that we know of in agriculture and food, military, transportation, health, finance, banking, telecommunication, and energy are all woefully inadequate in how they can act. Our country is at war with an enemy we cannot see, but the battle has the potential to inflict an incalculable amount of damage on our economy, our national defense, and families. A looming terrorist attack may not come in the form of a hijacked plane hitting a building, but from a terrorist cell lurking inside our computers at work and at home, ready to strike our banks, our energy grid, and other sectors. Cyber terrorists and hackers are not just unaffiliated rogue actors. They're highly trained special operations agents being employed by foreign countries. These startling developments and how the cyber war is evolving were revealed to me this past summer when we sat on the Special Cybersecurity Task Force formed by Speaker Boehner. These threats from abroad can manifest themselves in mysterious ways. Consider the potential weaknesses in our national security when the Marine Corps, Air Force, Federal Aviation Administration, and Federal Bureau of Investigation purchased counterfeit Cisco products that originated in China. Or that Beijing's military apparatus is tightening its rein over the country's technology sector when we realize the People's Liberation Army has formed IT workers into so-called cyber militias within thousands of companies across China. The threat of foreign nations waging cyber warfare against the United States is so real that the Defense Department is raising red flags about Huawei Technologies, the world's largest manufacturer of computer hardware, acquiring Symantec, a security company whose software is installed on computers at homes, business, and federal agencies across the country. We have to make sure that we are on alert for all levels of cybersecurity and following the IT purchasing line all the way through, as well as monitoring software and people's access to our computers. This threat is very real, and it is very active in our country and around the world. Failure to act means, once again, at dawn we sleep. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I don't see anyone on the minority side, so we'll go right to the first panel. As you know, the testimony that you're about to give is subject to Title 18, Section 1001 of the United States Code. When holding an investigative hearing, this committee has a practice of taking testimony under oath. Do you have any objection to testifying under oath? The Chair then advises you that under the rules of the House and rules of the committee, you are entitled to be advised by counsel. Do you desire to be advised by counsel during your testimony today? In that case, if you please rise and raise your right hand, I will swear you in. Do you swear the testimony that you're about to give is the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God? We now welcome you and each of you to give your 5-minute summary of your written statement. Start with you.
Okay. Chairman Stearns, Ranking Member Daggett, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify at today's hearing on IT supply chain security.
I think you have to, do you have the mic on?
Yes, I do.
Closer.
Just move it a little closer, that'd be good.
It's on. You just
Okay.
need to put it close.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity to testify at today's hearing on IT supply chain security. IT systems and the products and services that support them are essential to the operations of the federal government. These products and services are created and delivered through a complex global supply chain that involves a multitude of organizations, individuals, activities, and resources. My testimony today summarizes the contents of our recently issued report on IT supply chain risks and the extent to which the Departments of Energy, Homeland Security, Justice, and Defense have addressed these risks. But if I may first, Mr. Chairman, recognize some members of my team whose dedication and professionalism were instrumental to the development of this report. And this is Mike Gilmore,
What is Mike Gilmore's title? Can you give the
He's
title?
the Assistant Director
Okay.
for IT.
Okay.
R.J. Hagerman, who's a Senior Analyst, and Kush Malhotra, who is also an analyst in charge for our engagement.
Thank you.
In addition, there are two members who are not here, Brad Becker and Lee McCracken, who are back in their offices, who also played a key role. Mr. Chairman, the exploitation of IT products and services through the supply chain is an emerging threat. IT supply chain related threats can be introduced in the manufacturing, assembly, and distribution of hardware, software, and services. These threats include the insertion of harmful or malicious software and hardware, installation of counterfeit items, disruption in the production or distribution of critical products, reliance on unqualified or malicious service providers, and installation of software and hardware containing unintentional vulnerabilities. These threats can be exercised by exploiting vulnerabilities that could exist at multiple points in the supply chain. Examples of such vulnerabilities include acquiring products or parts from unauthorized distributors, using insecure transportation, storage, or delivery mechanisms, and installing hardware and software without sufficiently inspecting or testing them. These threats and vulnerabilities can potentially lead to a range of harmful effects, including allowing attackers to take control of systems or decreasing the availability of critical materials needed to develop or operate systems. The Departments of Energy, Homeland Security, Justice, and Defense varied in the extent to which they have addressed supply chain risks. Each of the four agencies participated in one or more interagency efforts to address supply chain security, such as developing technical and policy tools, collaborating with the intelligence community, and participating in the Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative on Supply Chain Risk Management. These efforts are key to understanding and addressing global supply chain risks. However, with respect to establishing supply chain protection measures for their internal departmental systems, three of the agencies had not fully addressed federal guidelines. These guidelines recommend that agencies for their high-impact systems define supply chain-related protection measures, develop procedures for implementing them, and monitor their effectiveness. However, Energy and Homeland Security had not yet taken these steps, and while Justice has defined supply chain protection measures, including a foreign ownership, control, and influence review, it had not yet developed implementing procedures or monitoring capabilities. The Department of Defense, on the other hand, has made greater progress. It has defined policies, requires program protection plans, issued key practices and implementation guide, conducted pilot programs, and implemented a monitoring mechanism to determine the status and effectiveness of its supply chain protection pilots. In our recently issued report, we recommended that the Departments of Energy, Homeland Security, and Justice take steps as needed to develop and document policies, procedures, and monitoring capabilities that address IT supply chain risks to their internal systems. The departments generally agreed with our recommendations. In summary, Mr. Chairman, the global IT supply chain introduces risks that, if realized, could jeopardize the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of federal information systems and adversely impact an agency's operations, assets, and employees. This risk highlights the importance for federal agencies to take appropriate actions to develop, document, and implement the policies, procedures, and controls necessary to cost-effectively manage the associated risk. Mr. Chairman, Ms. DeGette, this concludes my statement. Be happy to answer any questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you. Mr. Komarov, you're welcome. Opening statement.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for this opportunity to testify regarding the efforts of the Department of Defense pertaining to supply chain risk management. My name is Mitchell Komarov, and I'm the Director of Trusted Mission Systems and Networks within the Office of the DoD Chief Information Officer. I provided a written statement for the record, but would like to give you a brief overview of the globalization challenge facing the department and to highlight key elements.
Can you move your microphone a little closer?
And to highlight key elements of our strategy for managing the risks presented by it. The department relies heavily on custom and commercial off-the-shelf software, integrated circuits, computers, communication equipment, and other ICT, information and communications technology, to stay on the cutting edge of technology development and to fulfill mission-critical operations. With increasing frequency, the Department and its commercial supplier base rely on foreign companies to produce the most advanced technology solutions. Although the globalization of the ICT sector has accelerated the pace of technological innovation, it has raised national security concerns. Through the increased globalization of the ICT supply chain, adversaries have more opportunities to introduce malicious code into the supply chain and to gain access or disrupt military systems. To address this challenge, DoD is implementing its Trusted Defense Systems strategy to improve the way we engineer and acquire systems and to reduce an adversary's ability to disrupt national security missions. For years, the Department has worked to better understand and manage the risk that DoD hardware and software may contain malicious code. We were first confronted with this problem in connection with the supply of trusted application-specific integrated circuits, which we addressed through the Trusted Foundry program in 2003. The Department's strategy for achieving trustworthy systems in the face of supply chain risk contain the following core elements. 1, prioritizing scarce resources based on mission criticality. 2, planning for comprehensive program protection by identifying critical components and protecting them from supply chain risk informed by all-source intelligence. 3, improving our ability to detect and respond to vulnerabilities in programmable logic elements. And 4, partnering with industry. I want to briefly highlight the importance of prioritization to our strategy. The difficulty of mounting and defending against supply chain exploitation focuses supply chain risk management on sensitive mission-critical systems. Accordingly, DoD policy levies additional supply chain risk management processes and practices on national security systems. Supply chain risk management represents a sea change in the acquisition process. It requires new institutional relationships between the acquisition and intelligence communities and the application of operations security to processes that historically we have sought to make transparent. It also requires engineering and test and evaluation capabilities that are still the subject of ongoing research. Recognizing these challenges would take time to implement, former Deputy Secretary Lynn directed that an incremental implementation of supply chain risk management, beginning with pilots in FY9 and 10 and requiring full operational capability by FY16 for all national security systems. DoD is currently incorporating lessons learned during the piloting phase into permanent policy and practice. First, the Defense Intelligence Agency mission to support DoD acquisition with supply chain threat analysis has been made permanent in DoD policy. To date, the Defense Intelligence Agency has performed approximately 520 analyses for DoD acquisition programs. Other key tenets have been institutionalized as well, such as directing that programs integrate criticality analysis, use of supply chain threat information, supply chain risk management key practices, and hardware and software assurance into program protection. DoD actively collaborates with industry on supply chain risk. One of our key goals is to facilitate the development of commercial global sourcing standards. DoD has been collaborating with over 20 government and industry organizations towards the development of standards under the umbrella of ISO, the International Organization for Standardization. DoD is also actively engaged in the Open Group's Trusted Technology Forum. Within DoD, we have made a significant start to institutionalizing supply chain risk management, but still have a long way to go. Our key objective for FY12 is fully incorporating these concepts into information assurance and acquisition policies and expanding these new processes from the military departments to defense agencies. DoD has collaborated on these issues with interagency regarding proposed policies, practices, and best practices, such as the NIST Interagency Report and the Committee on National Security Systems Directive 505, both entitled Supply Chain Risk Management. In conclusion, mitigating risks to U.S. government missions arising out of the global supply chain from information and communications technology is vital to our national security. The Department looks forward to continuing collaboration with our interagency and industry partners to manage this risk. Thank you for the opportunity, and look forward to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. Mr. Vega?
Good morning, Chairman Stearns, Ranking Member DeGette, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Gil Vega, and I am the Associate Chief Information Officer for Cybersecurity at the Department of Energy. I also serve as the Department's Chief Information Security Officer. Thank you for this opportunity to testify today on the GAO report that is the subject of today's hearing. The Department of Energy appreciates the work performed by the GAO to identify opportunities to improve mission effectiveness by reducing IT supply chain risks. DOE shares GAO's concerns for these risks, which not only impact our missions, but those of all federal agencies and the private sector. DOE actively supports the goals outlined in the administration's recently released National Strategy for Global Supply Chain Security, and by leveraging the exceptional talent of the people in DOE, we are committed to addressing these challenges. It is clear that supply chain, including IT supply chain vulnerabilities, threaten the missions of DOE and other agencies. As the Department's Chief Information Security Officer, I am briefed daily on the active and persistent nature of threats directed at DOE. One of my primary roles is to evaluate these threats to our unique full-spectrum mission, from open science to energy research to nuclear security, and establish effective agency-wide programs to mitigate the associated risks in a cost-effective manner. In my short time at DOE, I have been privileged to work with cybersecurity thought leaders in our national laboratories and with interagency partners who are committed to addressing this national-level challenge by partnering and sharing information and best practices with each other. Aligned with the Secretary's goals related to energy, economic, and national security, we are leveraging the expertise of our national laboratories to develop processes and technology to effectively secure DOE's IT assets and to protect the nation's critical infrastructure. To address cybersecurity threats, you must first build sound foundational components, and by recognizing that no single organization can eliminate all risk. Recently, DOE has been successful in developing and delivering several key foundational elements to properly address the broader cybersecurity threats that we face, while strengthening our ability to meet the wide range of mission goals. For example, DOE has developed and is implementing an agency-wide NIST-based risk management approach that raises corporate threat analysis and risk decision-making to senior management levels of DOE and serves as a corporate foundation for managing our mission and investments with acceptable levels of risk. DOE is also implementing the Joint Cybersecurity Coordination Center, which is delivering a new cybersecurity ecosystem based on consolidated monitoring and reporting, information sharing and analysis, and coordinated incident response capabilities across the department. This is critical to the effective monitoring of mitigation strategies meant to address advanced cyber threats. As I previously stated, DOE recognizes the value and timing of the GAO review and concurs with GAO's recommendations. Specifically, we are already addressing these in a coordinated manner as follows. By actively participating in the national level policy discussions on supply chain risk management, by developing a supply chain cybersecurity strategy and policy that will foster DOE's interagency relationships and support the unified approach described in the administration strategy, by developing a plan to implement the requirements of the recently released Committee on National Security Systems Directive 505, by working closely with the National Counterintelligence Executive and the broader national intelligence and national security communities to stay abreast of and counter new and growing threats to the nation's IT infrastructure, and finally, by partnering with both DHS and DoD, industrial control system manufacturers, and energy critical infrastructure operators to identify and mitigate risks to industrial control systems. We must also recognize the importance of the role played by DOE's national laboratories, which have been at the forefront of identifying and mitigating vulnerabilities in the supply chain. DOE's national laboratories have developed and are actively involved improving capabilities in software and hardware assurance to mitigate risks, particularly to our national security systems and to the safety, security, and reliability of the nation's nuclear weapons stockpile. DOE works closely with other agencies on these emerging capabilities. In conclusion, we believe the GAO understands the national challenge that IT supply chain risks pose to all federal agencies as well as to the private sector, and believe further congressional support for nationally coordinated response is required. Again, DOE strongly supports the goals of the President's strategy, which seeks to align federal activities across the United States government, including in our partnerships with industry. DOE believes that this unified approach is the right approach and that policies and standards to address IT supply chain risk management must be coordinated at the national level. Thank you for this opportunity to discuss the report's findings. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement, and I look forward to answering all of your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Vega. Let me just open up with just sort of a general statement when we're talking about IT supply chain. And each is a question for each of you. Would you think the biggest emerging threat to the government and consumers is this IT supply chain? Just yes or no?
No.
No? Okay. Mr. Kermeroff? Yes or no?
For some systems, yes.
Mr. Vega?
I would say no.
No, okay. And when you talk about supply chains, I just want to define it. We're talking about smartphones, computers, GPS devices, smart grid devices. Have I missed out any one of the list I gave you?
It could be the whole slew
Panoply
of
of any
IT credits.
devices.
So there are additional types of devices and components of those devices to include
So
servers.
the four I mentioned, you think there could be more?
Yes.
Okay, and I'm just trying to get a general what we're talking about, if I can.
Yes, sir. So
More than those four devices we could be looking at?
yes, there's a
Okay.
huge
number. Can you give me maybe an ancillary one that we haven't thought about?
Well, there are just dozens and dozens of varieties of integrated circuits that
okay.
some systems integrators go out into the commercial marketplace
Gotcha. Okay.
to acquire.
Mr. Vega?
I'm not sure if I heard you say, but the underlying telecommunications infrastructure is another one that we are
Okay.
concerned about.
Mr. Wilson, this question's for you. You've identified risks to unprotected systems, including malicious code on hardware and software, counterfeit hardware or software, reliance upon malicious or unqualified service provider. What do you see are the two greatest threats to our IT supply chain?
I would say first, one would be the introduction or insertion of malicious code in hardware and software, and also presently counterfeits. Counterfeit items have been on the increase, and certainly that they can have a debilitating effect on systems that are currently in operation.
Can you give the committee a list of specific examples?
Sure. For
Examples of threats, I mean.
Well, threats and also incidents, if you will. You know, there is back in 2010, the Department of Commerce issued a report that did a survey of companies that participated in the DIB, in the Defense Industrial Base. And of the 387 companies that participated in the survey, 39% of them encountered counterfeit electronics during a 4-year period. And what's more, the number of incidents of those counterfeit items increased 140% over the 4-year period, from about 3,800 items in 2005 to about over 9,000 in 2008.
All right. Mr. Komarov, yesterday the GAO released a different report on counterfeit military parts manufactured overseas, showing the prevalence of counterfeit parts in the DoD's Internet purchasing system. Has the work you have done led to a similar conclusion?
Yes, sir. So I don't want to speak to the exact conclusions contained in that report, but within the report that we submitted to the Congress in 2010 in response to the 2009 Defense Authorization Act, the report entitled Trusted Defense Systems, where we outlined our strategy, we did identify risks during the sustainment and, in particular, counterfeits as a strategic gap in our strategies, and since that time immediately began working it within the department, and then more recently in collaboration with the intellectual property coordinator. Policy has been issued within the department identifying the Assistant Secretary for Supply Chain Integration as the lead for the department on counterfeit issues, and the department is pressing forward to work those issues.
What's a common specific threat to DoD supply chain that you've identified?
The common threats, sir?
What is the most common threat to Department of Defense's supply chain?
The most common occurring threat, presumably, would be in the realm of the counterfeit issue because of its prevalence. Again, that is typically a different sort of threat actor, and is more of a threat to the effectiveness of reliability engineering than the kind of threat that would be presented, for instance, with an attempt by a foreign intelligence service to insinuate itself into a national security system of great importance.
Mr. Vega, can you specifically give me actual cyber attacks or threats to the Department of Energy systems because of vulnerability? Can you any specific examples?
If I could.
Or are you aware of any cybersecurity threats, attacks to the Department of Energy?
I certainly
You don't have to
am.
get into detail, but I mean, are you aware of any specific threats?
Absolutely, and I would say, Chairman, that our number one concern at the Department of Energy are the coordinated efforts by some adversaries whose capabilities in the arena of computer hacking are world class. We've all read about these advanced persistent threats. We've had experience at the Department of Energy with incidents involving these threat actors, and that continues to be a major area of concern for us.
All right, my time has expired. The gentlelady from Colorado.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad to see you again, Mr. Wilshusen. When you were last here, you talked about cybersecurity risks for the electric grid, and we talked then about the risk of cyber attacks on the electric grid supply chain. So now I'm happy to have you back to talk about the threats and vulnerabilities in the IT supply chains. What are the key IT supply chain threats to federal agencies?
Well, we would say that it would include the insertion of malicious or harmful software and hardware into the environment, the installation of counterfeit items. It certainly would be key to that. And also any potential disruption in the production or distribution of these key items. Certainly that would also have a role in a key threat. And also I would finally say too is in terms of the installation of software, hardware that contains unintentional vulnerabilities. And these would be, for example, like design flaws in the equipment or software defects and coding defects into the software.
That could be taken advantage of.
Yes,
Yeah.
and indeed we often find that such defects are indeed taken advantage of once those software is in fact placed into operation at agencies.
And do you think most of the threats come through commercial items that are purchased by the federal government?
Yes, in
Okay.
some form or manner.
So why then are the federal agencies relying so heavily on these commercial components? Are there incentives in place for them to purchase these commercial items versus developing IT products in-house?
Oh, certainly. And I think it's the administration's policy to take full advantage of those commercial off-the-shelf products, both from cost savings as well as the functionality that they provide. It always gets back to kind of a risk management decision on whether or not we should use commercial products or potentially develop inside.
And in fact, there's an OMB circular that encourages agencies to purchase the off-the-shelf items wherever possible. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Mr. Komaroff, you're nodding your head yes, too.
As I understand the matter, it's been a long-term federal policy for some many years.
It's not just new under this administration. It's
That's
been in
right.
place for a long time. And even independent of the statutory incentives, is it even conceivable that federal government agencies would rely on non-commercial IT components for the majority of its work, Mr. Wilshusen?
For the majority of its equipment,
Right.
probably not, but there certainly would be instances where they may want to do something in a trusted environment in terms of developing a system or components to systems, particularly for those that have a great deal of sensitivity and criticality to potential.
So we're talking today about addressing the IT supply chain threats, and that's important. But we shouldn't forget that these threats impact just more than the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy. It's fair to say, isn't it, Mr. Wilshusen, that the threats you just described can also impact private sector commercial purchasers of IT products, correct?
Absolutely.
And the issue of commercial impact is important too, because much of our critical infrastructure, like the electric grid, for example, is run by private companies. And that's a network of private and public. So as the systems become more interoperable, the repercussions of one single flawed component piece becomes more powerful. Is that right?
I would agree.
So not all companies have the ability to closely vet IT supply chain threats to the product components they purchase, do they?
No.
And let me just give you an example. If there's a small business who's a contractor and they have 1 or 2 employees, they might not be able to make sure that the software they purchase isn't counterfeit or hasn't been infected with some kind of malware. Is that right?
That's very likely.
So can you give us some advice about what the right balance is here? You know, the federal government can't always ensure the security of every single purchase by even every single one of their contractors or their subcontractors. So what's the best way for us to use federal resources to try to, at best we can, achieve the goal of a secure supply chain?
Well, I think there's a couple things. First of all, the federal agencies and under the Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative, which is led by DHS and DOD, and they have developed a working group to look at different activities, threat assessment tools, and other best practices that could potentially be used to assess and to try to mitigate the risk associated with supply chain. And certainly to the extent a key focus of that initiative is to partner with the private sector. And certainly the private sector is a key part of the whole IT supply chain. And working with the private sector and using some of the tools developed by these agencies could be a benefit to other.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Myrick's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you all being here, and I appreciate your GAO report. It's an issue I've been spending a lot of time on lately. I'm especially concerned about foreign state-owned governments and militaries who are providing equipment, trying to get a foothold into this area. China is the main one that I have spent time on. And my concern is twofold. One, of course, with our government agencies, and I agree that the working groups are doing a much better job of trying to look over the whole spectrum of what's needed within the government. But going back to the question of the private sector and how we relate, because a lot of what we buy from the private sector as well, and they maybe don't know that they're either buying a piece of equipment or a router or something that is not good. I know we work with them, but how are we looking at across the industry? Is there anything else that you think we can do relative to putting more certainty into the fact that they know what they're doing and what they're providing to us? That's one question.
Okay, I would say certainly, with the interagency working groups that are looking at this, and indeed the administration just came out in January with its national strategy for global supply chain security. And one of the focuses of that particular strategy is to work with the private sector and state and local governments as well, and other stakeholders to look across the entire spectrum and looking at the threats, the vulnerabilities, gain a better awareness of those, and then to work collaboratively in developing the tools and techniques to try to mitigate that. So that certainly is a goal of this strategy. One of the things that we noted in looking at the strategy, however, is that it seems to focus on the movement of goods and services from point A to point B to point C, and not really address the manufacture or the assembly and integration of those products and components into supply or into full systems. And that's something that should probably be it's something that we just noticed in looking at it.
Well, see, part of that also is price, because everybody's looking at price today and they want to buy cheap. And the foreign governments or the foreign militaries or the people who are part of these companies are literally dropping their price so low that our companies can't compete with them. And so people will buy it just because it's cheaper. And we see that over and over and over again. And it's very frightening to me because we are at such high risk from the things that they can do to us. And so, you know, I just encourage all of you, I know you do it every day, but anything that you can do, you know, to look at this in your supply chain of what you buy and how you work with the private sector to help them, I would sure appreciate, because it's not going to get better, it's going to get worse. The ways they're trying to get equipment in here are frightening to me. So I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Scalise is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you having this, and appreciate our panelists who are here with us on the GAO report on supply chain. I apologize if this was already brought up. Mr. Vega, on the Department of Energy, there were some issues that they had brought up. I think they, you know, on DOD they had a pretty good assessment there, but on DOE they had raised some issues, and you know, especially when you look at some of the sensitive nature of some of the things that Department of Energy has, and of course management of our nuclear weapons stockpile, among other things. What if you could just kind of give me your take on the issues that were brought up in that GAO report?
Sure. I thank you for the question. I think the report brings up some very good recommendations, and I think there is some room at the Department of Energy to be more explicit about the policy relating to supply chain risk management, and also about the processes and also the controls to the systems to monitor the implementation of those processes. But I will tell you that the Department of Energy is very active in delivering some very foundational elements that are associated with detecting, mitigating, and responding to many different types of threats targeted at the Department of Energy. We have many threats that we're concerned about. Supply chain risk management is certainly one of those. You heard me talk about the organized attackers that target government agencies. There's also trusted insiders that we're focused on detecting and responding to. A whole litany of different threats are pointed at not only the Department of Energy but other cabinet agencies as well. Our focus on supply chain, however, is in the broader sense related to the risk management approach that the Department of Energy is embarking upon. Recently, in the past year, the Department of Energy has implemented this new risk management approach, which is mission-focused and allows and directs those business owners to direct limited resources at the things that are most important to the mission and the most sensitive data. My office has issued architectural frameworks that actually direct these business and system owners to account for supply chain risk management as part of their overall risk assessment process.
In the last year, have y'all had any reported incidents? You know, open this up to everybody. You know, what kinds of things have happened, and you know, we hear in the private sector all the time, and a lot of high-profile examples of you know, of systems that were violated, breaches that occurred, and in some cases we've identified back to specific countries where this is happening. You know, and have you had any of those experiences, and as you encounter some of the things that are happening, in some cases possibly government-led by foreign governments, do y'all talk to the State Department to, you know, to try to get some of those problems addressed at the state level, where we know there's some foreign countries that are trying to break into our systems, both government and private sector?
Without getting into too many specifics, the Department of Energy has experienced recent events that have been widely publicized in the past year at some of our national laboratories. Without speaking directly to the nation-state implications of those events, I will tell you that the Department of Energy is engaged at the interagency level with the White House on a government-wide response to to these advanced threats. And I'd be more than happy to talk to you more in a closed session about what some of those discussions entail.
Sure. Mr. Komarafa?
I would defer, to others on the broad spectrum of cyber-related exploitation that could be affecting the department's systems and networks. I think that shades into the presence of counterfeits and components and what have you that have been identified within the department. I don't think that there is strong enough evidence to present a no-kidding instance of what I would call a true supply chain exploitation, accounting for any one of them. Malicious code, so-called, accounts for, which is generally code injected into systems, typically remotely, frequently exploits the kinds of weaknesses and security defects in devices that we acquire. That's kind of a different problem and is the basics of information assurance and cybersecurity. Supply chain risk, as we address it, represents a much smaller set and much more difficult to discern. There will be instances where we put two and two together, see a threat actor, and examine equipment and find weaknesses associated with it. Those weaknesses frequently could be explained as either security-related defects or the failure to close engineering-type backdoors and what have you. Ultimately, it's a subtle matter trying to discern whether or not a particular instance is the case of an otherwise explicable defect or a no-kidding supply chain exploit.
I see my time's
Thank
expired.
you,
I appreciate your answers.
Gentleman
and I
from
yield back.
Texas, Mr. Green, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. American manufacturers rely heavily on the global supply chain to build products, and hardware for the devices can be made and assembled in any country in the world. Software code can be written everywhere. This means that foreign governments can have access to these components at several entry points. And these components can make their way into any number of places via government entities or private sector uses through critical infrastructure components and controls, and even through personal electronics. Mr. Bushhausen, are most IT product components manufactured in the U.S.?
I would say no.
Okay. Do you know where a lot of these components are manufactured?
Anywhere on the planet, generally. In the report we just issued, we have a diagram of a laptop. And from that, we identified various different components of your basic laptop, like the LCD, the motherboard, circuits, and storage, and hard drives. And each of those products could come from any number of multiple different countries, except for the motherboard. I think we only found that coming from Taiwan. But.
And oftentimes the purchaser of the ultimate product isn't aware of where all the components are from, because, again, if you buy if you buy your cell phone or your, BlackBerry or whatever. So as a government entity could purchase a product from an American brand and not be unaware of where all the component pieces within it were manufactured or assembled.
Yes, I would say definitely so.
Okay. It seems at least this leaves government purchasers heavily exposed, and right now companies are not obligated to inform the government and commercial or individual purchasers of where the products they sell come from. Mr. Bushhausen, do government entities currently track where all their components come from?
No, they don't. And particularly one of the objectives that we had in our report that we issued dealt with the extent to which the four agencies that we went to, Energy, Homeland Security, Justice, and DOD, on the extent to which they tracked the foreign location of these components, and none of them actually tracked those. But then again, they weren't required to track it either. And there is a thought that trying to do so would be cost prohibitive, and that perhaps a more indicative or an indication of the threat and risk would be not so much location of a facility where a component is prepared, but more is the influence that either Foreign Intelligence Service or some other organization may have over the entity, not its strict location.
So the obstacle is just the cost and the time frame. But is there a way that those four agencies have identified that they can make sure what they're purchasing has not been either compromised or to the point of maybe even the quality, not to the point, I'm not saying sabotage, but the quality would not be to the level we expect?
Well, one of the activities that these four agencies are conducting to an extent are threat assessments on certain level of acquisitions. Typically, these may be for their most highly sensitive acquisitions. And these threat assessments are for a particular product or service on a particular acquisition. And those threat assessments are then considered in some instances are being provided to a database or repository that's being kept by the Office of the National Counterintelligence Executive.
Okay. Mr. Komaroff and Mr. Vega, what are your agencies doing to address some of these obstacles? It's on the quality or the concern of the products we're using.
Sir, so at the Department of Energy, we rely on most of our competitively purchased IT commodity items. We rely on the General Services Administration through their contracting process to deliver those to the Department of Energy. While there is some assurance, I believe in the processes at GSA to validate pedigree of some of these devices and technologies, we understand that there's more we can be doing. I will tell you that we are very much engaged with the Office of the National Counterintelligence Executive in some piloted procurement working groups to better help understand what the actual threat to the Department of Energy is when dealing with some of these manufacturers.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, given our nation's reliance on components manufactured outside the U.S., I think it's important that we do everything in our power to ensure that at the very minimum we know where the threats may lie. It's important for manufacturers to be upfront about where the products they sell come from. It's also important for federal agencies to carefully vet the products they purchase. Securing our supply chain is not simply a private sector problem or a federal government agency problem, because it really affects all of us. And so I appreciate the chance to have this hearing
Thank the
today.
gentleman. And the gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Vega, last year, Bruce Held, the DOE's Director of Intelligence and Counterintelligence, noted that if a malicious actor controls your hardware or software, they control your system. Held went on to explain that the military does check the hardware and software in these systems for security vulnerabilities and possibly malicious code, but that this would be very costly for the private sector companies. Do you agree with Mr. Held?
I do agree with Mr. Held.
Are the IT products and service providers that you deal with checking their products?
Sir, I would have to answer that I believe some of our vendors have programs to vet their supply chains and some do not.
Yeah, and are you attempting to verify that they do? Is that part of what you're doing?
I think what we're doing, sir, is we are embarking on the process of developing explicit direction to our IT purchasers across the department to do exactly that.
Yeah. Has DOE ever identified a cyber incident or control systems incident that could be attributed to corrupted hardware or software linked to a supply chain vulnerability?
Sir, I would have to say in my short time at DOE, I have not been made aware of any confirmed supply chain threat that's been realized at the department. Doesn't mean there isn't. I'm just not aware of one.
And you told us in your opening testimony you've been with DOE in this position for how long?
A little bit more than 8 months, sir.
And before that?
I was the Chief Information Security Officer at Immigration and Customs Enforcement in the Department of Homeland Security.
Thank you, Mr. Vega.
Thank you.
I want to direct the next question, Mr. Chairman, to Mr. Wilshusen. To what extent will your report, the GAO's report work, shed light on critical infrastructure security? What role does Department of Homeland Security, as an example, have in coordinating information over supply chain challenges?
Well, with regard to your first question, with regard to the critical infrastructure protection, and that it would address it to the extent that as it relates to IT supply chain, the threats and vulnerabilities. What we found with regard to the supply chains that affect federal systems and federal agencies would also likely affect private sector because it's generally coming from the same global supply chain area. And so in that respect, it would be similar.
Well, you know, it's one thing to ensure standards for off-the-shelf software used by the U.S. government, but how do you communicate supply chain risk to the purchases of specialized control systems, software made internationally for use in very critical infrastructure?
Well, in terms of standards, in that federal government is pretty much just setting up for what its agencies need to do in terms of securing its software. But if a particular agency needs a particular security requirement or on its products, and it's acquiring those from a private sector organization, it would typically identify what those are in the contractual mechanisms that exist with that particular company to determine we need these particular security requirements in our software, in our hardware, in our systems, and then assure that the private sector organization is able to deliver.
And what metrics do you have in measuring progress on this front?
You know, I'm not sure there's that many metrics in that particular area that exist. In terms of percentage of contracts that have security requirements in it, I don't know of that.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, that's all the questions that I have, and I'll yield back the
I thank the gentleman.
Last minute.
You know, I think Mr. Gingrey made a good point. Mr. Vega, when will the Department of Energy finish its process of giving guidance to your suppliers for them to promote their supply chain's integrity? When is that date going to be?
Sir, it's hard to predict how long it will take for the department to
Isn't
develop.
DOE in charge of our nuclear stockpiles?
Yes, they are, sir.
Okay. It seems like you should have an answer. I mean, that's a strategic area that we want to be sure that you're protecting, and yet, I'd just like to actually get a date or when you're going to do something.
Absolutely.
To
Our
complete
current,
the process.
I'm sorry. Our current risk management policy requires our undersecretary organizations to account for supply chain risk within their risk management
So you don't
approach.
have a date then, huh? That's okay. Okay, I understand. How long has this been going on then?
I'm sorry. How long has what been going on, sir?
This whole process of trying to figure out to give guidance to your suppliers. You can't give a date when you're going to complete it, but have you started it?
We have started engaging the various programs.
Engaging, or you started it engaging?
We have started engaging.
And how long has this process been going on?
It's been going on since we were first contacted by GAO about
Which
the
is
report.
when? How long ago?
Since March of this year.
Okay. So you've only started this month. This month you've just started the whole process of guiding guidance to your suppliers to promote the supply chain integrity. So you've only been doing it for 2 weeks? Is that true?
With regard to the findings for the GAO report, that is true. However, there's a lot of other activities ongoing within the department.
Because I think many of us concerned the GAO report shows that DOE is the furthest behind in developing IT supply. You've confirmed it today that it's only in the last couple of weeks that you've even thought about giving guidance to your suppliers dealing with supply chain integrity. Let me ask this question. For example,
can I just follow up
well,
on your
you can
question?
take your own time because
Okay,
you can have a second time on this.
But I just want to
The gentlelady will
your
suspend.
question.
I'm involved with a question here. For example, DOD is in the process of using its intelligence authority in its procurement process. Does the Department of Energy have enough information to evaluate its vendors, or could you benefit from more information?
We can always benefit from more information, and we could always benefit from better collaboration. I will tell you that we are engaged in the interagency very actively with DOD, DHS, and the White House to share information and best practices, not only internal to DOE, but also with our Office of Energy Delivery and Office of Energy Reliability.
Okay, I think what happened is Mr. Gingrey had time, and they kept my time, so I still have more time in the original 5 minutes, which I was taking, so I assume I have another two minutes or so. Let me ask you this, Mr. Vega. Are you aware of any cyber attacks or threats to DOE systems that were because of a vulnerability to a supply chain?
I am unaware of any.
Okay. What types of supply chain threats has the DOE ever faced?
Well, I think we faced supply chain risks to our nuclear surety program.
To your what program?
To our nuclear surety program, which is a program.
How about your nuclear stockpile program? Have you? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay.
Which is why the department actually operates 2 trusted foundries at both Kansas City and Sandia to provide for the surety of that mission. Okay.
Well, based upon this, I think you should have been ahead of the curve instead of just the last 2 weeks giving guidance to your suppliers. What specifically is DOE doing to partner with industrial control system manufacturers and energy critical infrastructure operators to identify and mitigate risk to industrial control system?
Our organization has been working closely with the Office of Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability to share lessons learned and best practices at the department with the sector on control systems. However, that organization is led by an Assistant Secretary Hoffman. I'd be glad to take your question back for the record to get you more information on those lessons learned.
All right. What is the one risk or threat to federal IT supply chains you're most concerned about, and what are you doing to address it?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the beginning of your question.
What is the one risk or threat to federal IT supply chains you're most concerned about at DOE?
I can't say that I'm concerned more about a specific IT supply chain risk. I think we've heard many from our panelists here. There are many that can be manifested in our environment if we're not careful. As I've said in my remarks, we have spent a lot of time and energy developing foundational elements to help us detect, mitigate, and respond to that threat as well as many other threats we're facing.
Okay. I think we'll recognize Ms. Gett since she was interested.
Mr. Chairman, I was just trying to follow up on the question you were asking of Mr. Vega. Mr. Vega, you said that you guys have just started this process with the contractors this month, correct?
In response to the GAO report, that's correct.
Yes, and so when do you expect that process to be completed?
We expect that process to follow our internal
Yes, I understand that, but when do you expect it to be completed? You wouldn't give the chairman a date, but perhaps you have a time frame.
I would say, Ms. DeGette, probably
It's DeGette.
DeGette, I'm sorry,
That's
I apologize.
okay.
I would say the beginning of next calendar year we would have some good progress made.
Well, okay. What does that mean, good progress made?
The Department of Energy is a very diverse organization with varying missions and varying threats of varying appetites for threat and risk. The idea that the department can quickly issue policies, procedures, and monitoring systems for that entire complex in a short amount of time is probably not a good assumption. It will take
Mr.
time.
Vega, here's our concern, and I think I can say the chairman shares this concern, is we understand that all the complexities of the DOD, and this is what I was talking to Mr. Wilshusen about earlier, is that if there are threats, we need to identify them. We need to identify the severity and where they occur so that we can begin addressing them. And vague answers like this are very disconcerting to people on both sides of this panel because After all, it's the Department of Defense. So I think my suggestion, I'm sorry, the Department of Energy. And so what I would suggest is that you folks, now you've got this GAO recommendation, and you're putting a process into place. I would suggest that you put a clear timeline into place about goals and results, culminating at the earliest possible convenience. We don't want corners to be cut or anything like that, but we think it would, and then work with this committee to inform us about what the plan is. I think our concern is that the plan seems a little vague just sitting here today. And with that, I'll yield back.
I thank the gentlelady, and Mr. Terry is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Vega, I apologize that I was in, all three of you, in an anteroom in a quick meeting that lasted a few minutes more. I walked in during your answer, and I didn't really hear what Mr. Gingre's question is, so it piqued me I was really interested. Who, just very bluntly then, so I'm clear, in regard to having a cybersecurity plan for a critical infrastructure nuclear power plant, who is best to oversee that cyber plan, DOE or Homeland Security?
Who is best to oversee a cybersecurity plan for a privately owned power generator? Is that the question?
Okay, let's say a public power nuclear facility. I don't care.
Yeah.
It's nuclear.
Right.
And it's under DOE.
It is DOE. I have to say, sir, that my focus on cybersecurity is internal to the Department of Energy and the federal and M&O contractors that operate our national labs. I'm not that familiar to offer an informed opinion about who would be better overseeing the implementation of a cybersecurity plan at a private or public.
I was hearing that you were saying that perhaps the Department of Homeland Security was better prepared to do that. And I'm trying to figure out where their nuclear power plant expertise would be.
I'm not sure what you heard, sir.
Okay. But I just want to clarify that. What's that? All right. So evidently, were you suggesting Mr. Wilshinson? Sorry.
No, that's okay. Will Shusen.
Will Shusen, just like it's written. I'm sorry. Did you suggest that Homeland Security would be better supervising, overseeing cybersecurity techniques and plans for nuclear power plants, which would obviously, because they're nuclear, would probably be defined as critical?
I did not suggest that, but I will mention that, and it's not as part of this report on IT supply chain, but DHS does have a role in terms of being the sector under the National Infrastructure Protection Plan and Program. DHS does have a role in providing guidance and overseeing the, I think it's a nuclear power industry. Also, Nuclear Regulatory Commission would be a member and would have insight into that, since they're regulators of these nuclear power plants. Yeah. And they also
is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission under Homeland Security's umbrella, or another agencies like DOE's?
It's a separate
it's an
agency
independent
within the federal
agency.
government. It is separate.
All right.
And so they also specify some of the security requirements as in its role as a regulator of nuclear power plants to give security. And they do conduct certain reviews over that.
Well,
I do believe
I'm going to ask you one follow-up or a question that stood out to me during your testimony, but quickly, Homeland Security, under my personal view, has been a disaster. And to put them in charge of cybersecurity of any critical infrastructure scares the hell out of me, frankly. And every time I go through an airport, I think of how incompetent they are. So that's just my statement for the record. I'm sorry I was looking at you when I said that. But you mentioned in the chain, supply chain, that we're concerned about the unauthorized, which then led me to the question of what needs to be authorized? What parts of the supply chain? Is it the individual parts at the assembly? Who's going to be able to have the authority to say that they're authorized to approve that this chip can go into this computer that can be sold into the Defense Department? I can't get my mind around who would have that level of authority, and you have 28 seconds.
Okay. Well, first of all, yeah, when I mentioned the word unauthorized, it dealt with acquiring products or parts, components, if you will, from unauthorized distributors, as opposed to those companies or entities, either the original component manufacturer or their other approved, if you will, suppliers to provide it. So if an agency were to go to some other, through some other distributor that's not authorized to sell a particular product, that was the vulnerability that to which I was referring.
All right, we'll let the first panel be dismissed, and we'll have the second panel come up. Thank you very much for your time. Oh, you're smart. Welcome, the second panel. We have Mr. Larry Castro, Managing Director of Chertoff Group, and we have Dave Lonsberry, Chief Technical Officer of the Open Group. We welcome each of you, and at your convenience, Mr. Castro, we'll let you start with your opening statement. Huh? Oh, yeah. But first we have to swear you in. Got you far apart here. I think you two could get closer. It's up to you. Why don't you move in together? Just we get you both a little closer here. And each of you should have a mic. Ready to go? All right. As you know, the testimony that you're about to give is subject to Title 18, Section 1001 of the United States Code. When holding an investigative hearing, this committee has a practice of taking testimony under oath. Do you have any objection to testifying under oath? No. The chair then advises you that under the rules of the House and the rules of the committee, you are entitled to be advised by counsel. Do you desire to be advised by counsel during your testimony today? In that case, you please rise and raise your right hand. I will swear you in. Do you swear the testimony that you're about to give is the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Now, if you'd be so kind to give your 5-minute opening statement, Mr. Castro, we'll start with you. Welcome.
Good morning, Chairman Stearns, Ranking Member DeGette, and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today regarding the important role of IT supply chain security in our nation's approach to cybersecurity. I'm appearing today in my personal capacity, although for the record I am currently a managing director at the Chertoff Group, a firm that provides strategic advisory services on security matters, including cybersecurity. While my work at Chertoff Group informs much of my current insight into the cybersecurity threat environment, my basic understanding of information assurance and cybersecurity is drawn from my 44 years of federal service at the National Security Agency. It's thus from these two perspectives that I offer my views for your consideration today. I commend the subcommittee for addressing this topic today. As the GAO report well describes, securing the supply chain is a challenging and complex task with many moving parts and dependencies. I would suggest, however, that it's not an intractable problem, and it is one that can be addressed in a risk management framework. The GAO report documents that there's ample policy direction and implementing guidance from which one can start to build supply chain defenses. What is needed, however, is a framework that can build on that policy base and also support the implementation detail. Risk management offers such a framework. Risk management approaches security from the aspects of threats, vulnerabilities, and consequences, and can be used to unwrap some key supply chain issues. Let's first consider the threat actors who might both be able to benefit from and execute an infiltration of the supply chain, perhaps by inserting a modified component into the supply chain of a critical U.S. government IT enterprise. To do so, of course, the adversary must be capable of penetrating the production process at a point far enough downstream to ensure that the right target has been infiltrated. In addition to performing the adversary's desired covert function, the modified component must also execute the component's function as originally designed. I would submit to you that across the spectrum of threat actors in cyberspace today, the most likely players to have the motive and the capability to successfully accomplish such a deception would be nation states. So who then would be the nation states that might have the necessary qualifications and motives? The GAO report notes, and you've heard already in testimony today, about an outstanding organization on point within the federal government for identifying such threat actors. That organization is the Office of the National Counterintelligence Executive, or NCIX, within the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. In October 2011, NCIX published this eye-opening report to the Congress entitled Foreign Spies Stealing U.S. Economic Secrets in Cyberspace. The report convincingly presents the case that both the People's Republic of China and the Russian state apparatus have both the intent and capability to undertake economic espionage enhanced by cyber means. These are the key threat actors against whom our supply chain defenses should be aligned. What consequences do they seek to achieve by infiltrating the U.S. supply chain? The scope of objectives spans the full range of results achievable from malicious activity in cyberspace, some of which you all have already addressed this morning. They include the compromise of confidentiality, leading to the loss of sensitive data and intellectual property, the loss of availability of critical national security systems, and the corruption of data residing in these critical systems. Has already been discussed today, there are numerous vulnerabilities in the supply chain that can be exploited. There are, however, well-documented best practices and tools that may be implemented to address some of these vulnerabilities, and I believe the next speaker on the panel will address some of those. The use of these tools and resources, however, must be considered in the context of likely threat actors and the consequences that they seek to achieve. Finally, I'd like to comment about a section of the GAO report, again, that you already discussed this morning, dealing with the lineage of equipment used in U.S. government networks. While the report concluded that emphasis is not given to determining if such networks contain foreign developed components, the intelligence community representatives quoted in the report offered the view that determining if a relationship exists between a supplier company and a foreign military or intelligence service, that would be a more reliable indicator of a potential security risk than simply ascertaining whether a specific product was manufactured or provisioned outside the United States. I strongly endorse this conclusion and note that the practice of conducting such due diligence audits of supplier-sponsor links is well established in the private sector. For maximum effectiveness, however, this due diligence requires a good conduit to move high-fidelity threat actor information between the U.S. intelligence community and those in the private sector who would benefit from the intelligence community's insights. It's encouraging that many of the cyber bills under consideration by you all this session address the need for such improved information sharing. Again, thank you for the opportunity to address this topic, and I would be pleased to answer your questions at the appropriate time.
And I thank you, Mr. Lonsberg. Your opening statement, please.
Chairman Stern, Ranking Member DeGette, and distinguished members of the committee. On behalf of the Open Group and the Open Group Trusted Technology Forum, I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak to this IT supply chain security hearing to discuss how the Open Group's Trusted Technology Forum plans to address some of the challenges in securing the global supply chain that have been discussed today. A little background, the Open Group is a global consortium that enables the achievement of business objectives through IT standards. We have more than 400 members spanning all sectors of the IT community, from customers to vendors to integrators and consultants, as well as academics and researchers. And staff works with them to capture and understand, address their current and emerging requirements, and establish the policies to share best practices, to facilitate interoperability and develop consensus around evolving and integrating standards. And to back this, we operate an industry premier certification service operating a variety of certification programs over 20 years. In 2008, the then current Undersecretary for the Department of Defense Acquisition Technology and Logistics posed the following challenge to the Open Group members. How can the DoD safely procure IT technology from an increasingly global and sometimes unpredictable supply chain in a rapidly changing threat environment? The discussion focused on the challenges associated with an increased reliance on commercial off-the-shelf information communication technologies in commercial and government enterprises, including the defense industry. Parties formalized those discussions to an initiative under the Open Group that we call the Open Trusted Technology Forum. And that is a forum, it's a global initiative that brings in government, industry, and other interested participants to work to develop an open trusted technology provider standard that's a public-private partnership to address this very clear cybersecurity challenge in a shared multi-stakeholder risk environment like the global supply chain. Member organizations contributing to the work include a broad range of global suppliers, buyers of products, and third-party test labs. The Open Trusted Technology Provider Standard, which is currently published as a snapshot, provides organization commercial best practices that, when properly adhered to, will enhance the security of the global supply chain and the integrity of COTS ICT products throughout the entirety of the product life cycle. That's from the design phase to the sourcing of the components, build, fulfillment, distribution, sustainment, and all the way to the disposal phase. Snapshot was released in March and is intended to become an open group standard which will be available to everyone. And this provides a set of best practice requirements and recommendation on two types of risk inherent in the acquisition and use of COTS ICT products. First is tainted product risk, and that is a product is produced by the provider and is acquired through legitimate or reputable channels but has been tampered with maliciously. The second is the counterfeit product risk, where a product is produced other than by or for the provider or is supplied by other than a reputable channel and is presented as being legitimate. The standard is based on best practices that have been contributed from the experience of very mature industry providers and the results rigorously reviewed through an open consensus process. Standards sufficiently detailed and prescriptive enough to be useful in raising the bar for all the technology suppliers. And it really lends itself to an accreditation process that will provide assurance that it's being followed in a meaningful and repeatable manner. And by adopting the standard and committing to conform to these best practices, technology providers, whether it be hardware or software component suppliers and integrators, will help ensure the integrity of their COTS ICT products. Now, given the very fast-paced change of technology and risk landscape, the OTTF plans to evolve the OTTPS standard over time. And so as specific threats emerge or the market needs evolve, then the forum will update the standard to address these threats or changes. We take a very comprehensive view about the practices a provider should follow in order to be considered to be a trusted technology provider that builds with integrity, allowing its customers to buy with confidence. Chairman Stern, Ranking Member DeGette, and members of the committee, thank you again for the opportunity. I want to offer up the expertise of the Open Trusted Technology Forum to the subcommittee and other congressional committees as they continue to examine supply chain issues. We look forward to working together to address the critical problem of improving global supply chain security. Thank you.
And I thank you, and I'll start with my first set of questions. I'll ask you the first question that I'm trying to get an answer to, which I asked the first panel, to each of you. Is the biggest emerging cybersecurity threat to consumers and government agencies the cybersecurity threats to the supply chain, IT supply chain? Yes or no? You want me to repeat the question? Is the biggest emerging cybersecurity threat to consumers and government agencies the cybersecurity threats to the IT supply chain? Yes or no? And yours?
My answer would be no as well.
And if not, what is? In the first panel, one person said yes and two said no, but I forgot to ask them what is. What is, Mr. Castro, that preempts this, in your opinion?
The threat is the...
Can you have your mic on?
Yeah. The threat is the remote access threat enabled by poor practices on the intended victims' end of either not having adequate defense in depth and protection of critical data, and also, quite frankly, increasingly, folks are just succumbing to phishing attacks that are very, very well constructed. But those phishing attacks are the entry point for a remote access attack attempting to acquire mostly intellectual property.
Not in the supply chain.
No, I would not put the supply chain in that.
That's
sense.
interesting. Mr. Lonsberry?
I believe the supply chain is part of the problem. I think the actual immediate risk is from external attack, whether from outsiders or people who have been placed inside organizations.
So you're not worried about malware or all these other things. You're worried about somebody externally, either through phishing or some kind of overt action, getting in and then having the piece of software placed there.
Malware is part of that problem.
Yeah.
The
Getting it in
of
there.
Malware takes advantage.
But you're not
of
worried about the supply chain per se as you are worried about somebody overtly coming in.
Yeah, the supply chain encompasses many phases throughout the life cycle.
Yeah, okay.
Of the
It
product.
gets complicated. Okay. All right. Each member, what are the current supply chain practices and processes that could prevent or detect corrupt, compromised, or counterfeit components in the supply chain? Mr. Castro?
Well, I mentioned the one that we observe most frequently with the clients that we support, and that is a very aggressive due diligence program, not quite frankly on every component that a company might buy, but the identification of where the critical paths are, the paths that lead to a company's crown jewels, and then ensuring that every component that might be compromised in that path has been vetted, not only in terms of the pedigree of the component, but knowing who are the people responsible for servicing it and the other support structure around it.
Mr. Lonsberry.
There are many steps in the development and furnishing of a product. And what we look at is the organizational best practices to make sure that a supplier is using the best practices during their processes throughout the supply chain to make sure that they are doing everything they can to prevent those vulnerabilities from being there so they can't be exploited later.
Who in the supply chain should ensure tighter chain of custody controls, Mr. Castro?
The question again is who in the
supply chain should ensure tighter chain of custody controls?
Well, again, I would just go back to the simple thing that we practice every day in each of our lives, and that is buyer beware. If there's a purchasing order that's cut on behalf of an engineer in a company, then we would look to the engineer to make sure that, to the best extent possible, that they've been able to vet the pedigree of the product.
Mr. Lonsberry?
I would concur with Mr. Castro. Each link in the chain has to look up to its suppliers and also downstream for its responsibility for the fulfillment, delivery, sustainment, and eventual retirement of the products that it sells.
What can government do to create or incentivize the deployment of those additional capabilities that some of you folks would think is necessary? What can we do?
Well, again, going back to my testimony, I think the biggest thing that the government provides is information with regard to the source of potential threats and activity that's seen in this space. Again, the Office of the National Countering Executive Program has been commended as exemplary in this case. They have a very vigorous outreach to industry to try to provide, both at the classified level and to the unclassified level, an understanding of where the problems are.
Focusing on the use of COTS ICT, the most important thing the government can do is, in fact, as said just a moment ago, is to make sure that it is using best practices when it does procurement to make sure that they've identified trusted technology partners.
My time has expired. The gentlelady from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we continue our reliance, to increase our reliance on technology, we need to really look at all the implications of its use and including the vulnerabilities and threats presented by new technologies. So, Mr. Castro, I wanted to ask you, do you think that the threats due to the new technologies are increasing in scope and sophistication?
I'm sorry, the threats are what?
The threats due to the new technologies are increasing.
Oh, no question about it. An example would be smartphones and the applications that go on them. The application industry has just exploded. Some suppliers and some maintainers of application supply stores do some vetting, but quite frankly, that is an area that we all should be concerned about as we buy a very cheap app to put on our phone. So yes, I agree with you.
And almost 2/3 of U.S. firms report that they've been victims of cybersecurity incidents or information breaches. And as you allude to, the volume of malicious software on American networks has more than tripled since 2009. And so I'm wondering in specific about the challenges the federal government faces in responding to those rapidly evolving threats.
Well, again, the role of the government, in my view, is education. There's a tremendous amount of information that the government holds, both open source and classified, that should be made available to the private sector through properly vetted information channels. Okay.
Now, James Clapper, who's the Director of National Intelligence, was talking to the Senate committee about a year ago, and he talked about a new phenomenon known as convergence. Are you familiar, Mr. Castro, with network convergence?
Yes, ma'am.
And can you talk about what that is?
Well, I think in terms of that we would understand, it's where we rely upon each of the devices in a integrated way.
Right.
So it may be that your BlackBerry might be linked and synced to your home personal PC or to your laptop.
Right.
And so the problem there is that a vulnerability in one part of that chain is easily introduced into the other parts of the chain.
Into the other parts. So it's because video, data, voice, everything are all converging on one common network. And that's part of this new technology that has developed that you talk about, like with the iPhones and things like that, right?
Right.
And I'm wondering if both of you could talk about the risks of that type of convergence technology, the increased vulnerabilities if they're put into cyber terrorist hands.
Okay, I'll briefly, although I'll be repeating myself a little bit, but an example would be if you bought an app for whatever smartphone, mobile device you have that is corrupted, it is quite possible that that can be the front door that allows someone to have access to your own home personal machine, where you might have some more sensitive data stored, or you might have the keys to being able to get to your financial accounts and things of that nature.
And that can be extrapolated to problems on the government networks too, right?
Well, yes, but fortunately, in most places in the government, this whole notion of how to deal with mobile devices is undergoing quite a bit of scrutiny. Policies are being adopted that would provide some partitioning between mobile users and the enterprise that they support.
Well, I'm thinking about, I'm glad they're putting policies into place, but I'm thinking about, like, if there's a national lab and there's a smart device being used to collect and process information for research at a national lab, if someone was able to get in there, that could cause significant harm, correct?
Well, there's a potential for that, but since you talked about the national labs, I will tell you that in my experience and time in government, that they are some of the most very, very far in front, as Gil mentioned, with regard to constructing the kind of policies and actual hardware limitations to prevent that, particularly in dealing with some of the more sensitive things that the labs do. But your point's very, very well taken. The threat of mobile devices is one that has really mushroomed onto the landscape, and it's one that we're all scrambling to try to find the right balance between providing the individual user the flexibility that the mobile device provides, but also protecting the integrity of our data.
Mr. Lansbury, do you want to comment on that very briefly?
I think there are a couple of comments. First, the issue about the growth and capabilities of computer systems and networks is a coin with two sides. Of course, the increase in complexity does come with an increase in vulnerability, yet it also adds the ability, the additional processing power and the additional awareness of what's going on to actually recognize attack and proactively create defenses. I concur with the issue of convergence. Sometimes you hear it as called as bring your own device, where there are new devices coming in that may bring their own vulnerabilities. And so this is why it is in fact essential to have not only policies, of course, beyond the supply chain, but also in the supply chain to make sure that those devices that are coming in have undergone the scrutiny and correct practices to make sure that they're safe.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Terry, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And you're here as a different perspective from the first panel, kind of the non-governmental perspective. And so I kind of want to follow through with your unique position here for today's hearing. And we heard the gentleman from GAO talk about unauthorized materials or whatever, computers, devices. And I want to work through that because I'm still very concerned about how loose the authorizations may be. It seems to me that the best practice that's being recommended here for any of for Department of Defense or DOE or whatever government agency that's dealing with critical issues is that they should only be allowed to purchase from an authorized vendor, of which evidently the vendor then has certified everything back, that they can then trust the individual parts, whether it's software, chips, hardware, have not been compromised in any way. So my question to you is that a best practice? Do we need to add more definition to it, and do we need to further authorizations down the supply line? Mr. Castro and then Mr. Lounsbury.
I guess, if I may start, I would concur with what you say there. Ultimately, use of COTS implies that an agency, in this case government agency, purchases from a commercial marketplace. And so the question is, what are the standards that your supplier uses to demonstrate that they can be trusted? Part of that would be the processes they have for themselves throughout their product development and fulfillment life cycle, but also, are they imposing those standards on their suppliers as well? You think about, first you design a product, then you get sources for components. Those components have to undergo the same standards or be held to the same standards that you would hold yourself to as a trusted vendor.
And do you think that's sufficient, that they just, I don't have the confidence that the supplier actually has any level of control in India or China or manufacturing facilities. How do they have a level of surety that something's not being compromised way down the assembly line?
Well, in the commercial world, typically we look to some sort of a conformance program where a supplier would submit evidence either through a third-party lab and certainly to an independent certification authority to make sure that they have, in fact, given some evidence of those best practices before they are, recognized as a trusted partner. And then, yes, there is the burden of everybody in the supply chain of making sure that their partners are trusted. It's a very, fast branching supply chain, and it's really, You've got to pick a scalable way of doing that.
All right. Mr. Castro, do you have anything to add to this?
I would offer, quite frankly, and this may be a little bit out of skew with the thrust of your question, but I can't divorce my 44 years in government service either. I think this has to be approached with a really sensible sense of scale and scope, in that you're not going to test every resistor that goes into every motherboard of every computer. And I think the DoD program is exemplary in this, in that they've prioritized those systems that they believe should have this extra scrutiny. The other thing that the customer can always do, that is to say the person at the end, is you pick every fifth Dell computer that comes out of the box, and you really run it through its paces to the greatest extent you can. And there are folks who are very, very good at that, including looking for signs of tampering and things of that nature. So some random periodic, I said every fifth, but it would be a random sampling of the devices that you get. But the point being that unless you're willing to authorize extraordinary amounts of money in this area, it has to be done with some reasonable balance involved.
Thank you.
Thanks, gentlemen. Gentleman from Georgia, Ms. Gingrich, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Lonesberry, how can the government and the private sector benefit from a public-private partnership in developing international standards?
I think there are a couple of ways that can happen. First, the government quite often brings a unique set of needs and perspectives and set of requirements to the party. And of course, on the other hand, any provider who values their reputation wants to make sure that their products will meet those needs so they can frankly sell into that sector. Right? Of course, they have to do it in a way that still keeps them in a commercial business. So there's that match of buyer need and supplier response. The other part is we have to recognize that, and as we've heard many times, the supply chain is global. You know, it says on some of our devices, designed in California, made in China, right? And so these have to be international standards so that the bar can be raised on a global basis, so that if you know that you've seen a trusted technology provider here, and I do want to emphasize that when we look at this, we talk about the organization, not a specific product. So we look at, is that organization following these best practices in a verifiable and certified way? And you can look.
Well, let me interrupt you just for a second because of the limitation of my time, and I'll cut right to the chase. More importantly, how do you envision other countries implementing the international standards of the open group?
The open group, first, our standards are principally commercial standards. These are ones where companies voluntarily comply with them and enter into certification programs. We do, however, have a liaison with ISO, the international standards body, and specifically the working groups within ISO that will take these standards and make them international. We're very active in making sure that happens. So there are both de facto standards that can be adopted by industry and de jure standards that can be implemented by nations.
If standards such as these are implemented internationally, should the United States refuse to do business with countries that don't implement those standards?
I think that when the United States procures things, they should procure from suppliers that have taken the time to do the job right by following the international standards.
Thank you. And Mr. Castro, the current approach to IT supply chain risk is a patchwork of varying policies and procedures that are not coordinated across the government. What can be done to facilitate a coordinated approach that reasonably and adequately addresses the risk while avoiding excessive cost, burdensome regulation, or marginal results?
All right. That's a tough one, Congressman. I think it begins with the fact that my sense from where I sit is that within the government there has been a very, very succinct wake-up call. It's evidenced in the testimony that General Clapper and others have provided to you and other committees. The other thing is that it is increasingly becoming threat-based, and that was part of the essence of my oral statement, is that we simply can't go down every road, but we know where there are two very, very big roads that we have to watch. But clearly, all the things that you asked for in that question represent the nirvana at the end of the process. I'm not sure we're anywhere close to being there.
Let me follow up on that with this. For example, the GAO report, it highlighted deficiencies of DOE, DHS, DOJ, Department of Justice, and rightly recommends corrective action. Their recommendations for executive action is directed at each department individually, if I understand it, the report. How should the government coordinate this solution for the entire federal government?
Well, again, I think that the way the federal government is organized, that there's no doubt somebody in OMB who has this in their portfolio to coordinate across. But the other thing I think that's recognized in the report is that one size does not fit all. As the committee members have already pointed out, you have concerns about DOE because they have such a critical part of not only our national security structure, but our energy provision structure. The report also singled out DHS, but quite frankly, DHS is not a big component in terms of driving the IT enterprise.
Well, let me real quickly, because my time is running out. I really respect the fact that you've got 44 years of experience at the federal level. But you know, it would seem to me that lack of coordination would be more advantageous, let's say, to a company that, like the one that you currently work for, the Chertoff Group, whereas from the federal government perspective, coordination would be better, more coordination. So where do you draw the line in regard to that?
Well, again, I think it's a balance. There definitely needs to be a common set of standards, a common set of government regulations that OMB would administer and adhere and see, just like they do FSMA, and report in the same way as FSMA compliance is reported. But I think also that Mr. Vega at DOE has a set of problems. The DOD program has a different set of problems. As long as they meet the common standard, then they can go in their directions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you both, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. A gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I don't think I'll take the whole 5 minutes, so if anybody has other questions, I'll be happy to yield. But I do have one that I've been listening to the testimony and bringing myself a little education on this, which is why I like coming to these hearings. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding it. You indicated, Mr. Castro, that one of the things we need to do is have the Department of Defense working with private industry, and I agree with that. But my question is, at what point do they step in, and do they need to be taking an active role in defending our private industries? Here's the dilemma that I've got. In World War II, the Allies broke the German code. They had to make some very tough choices, and history looks back on some of those choices very critically. But they had to make some tough choices because they knew some things the Germans were doing, but they knew if they stopped it, there might be the possibility that the Germans would figure out they'd broken the code, and then that would endanger all kinds of other operations. So now we're faced in a slightly different situation. If the defense folks know that somebody is stealing our private information because they have tapped into it by their defensive measures and trying to protect our national security on the defense side, how do they work out balancing that out, and how do they tip off, or do they just take measures on behalf of private industry to defend our economic system without tipping off XYZ country that we're on to them? That's the basic gist of my question. You can help me on that.
Well, very well founded. The difference where the analogy isn't quite possibly in sync is that the time frame that we were operating with regard to the breaking of Ultra and things like that you referred to in World War II, we had a much greater time frame to a duty cycle. Today, it moves much more quickly, and therefore I do come very much into the direction that your question was going, and that there needs to be greater transparency between what the intelligence community within the DoD sees and making that information available to the private sector. And again, very I think well spoken is the fact that there are bills before the House particularly the one out of the HFC, the Rogers-Rutherford bill, that does attempt to address that issue and put, quite frankly, the DoD intelligence assets into the game, properly supporting through the DHS front door the private industry. So your analogy is very, very well taken, and I understand and totally agree.
Okay. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, with that, unless somebody wants me to yield time to him, I would yield my time back to the chair.
Gentleman yields your time back, and I'm just going to ask 2 questions, and then the gentlelady is welcome to offer her questions. A question for both of you. Who should be the innovator in this place in developing a common criteria network? Should it be the government or the private sector?
Mr. Chairman, I actually believe that the public sector does need to lead in this area.
Government should, okay.
Pardon me, excuse me, the commercial sector.
Commercial sector, okay.
Sorry to be unclear.
And you, Mr. Castro?
I would agree.
Okay. Are there advantages in basically because the private sector is more innovative and
I think it's a question of...
because it's closer to their bailiwick?
I think it's a question of market pressure, sir.
Yeah.
I think the pace of innovation forces them to respond very quickly, and frankly, they need to innovate and respond at the speed that is driven by the market and by the emerging threats.
You agree?
I agree.
Yeah. Mr. Castro, if one begins from the premise that a supply chain vulnerability has already been exploited and currently exists within an IT enterprise, what should a supplier, or that matter, an agency do to mitigate this risk?
Okay. Well, this, in fact, is the topic of the moment. It's called presumption of breach or operating under attack. If you
presumption of
that your system has been breached, and that's the way you go about constructing the defense.
Okay.
DoD put out their strategy for operating in cyberspace last summer. That is at the heart of it. What you then have to do, however, is to say if, in fact, the assumption is that the adversary is in my system, I need to identify very, very precisely what are my crown jewels in that I hold in that system, and I need to protect those to the maximum extent possible, and I need to make sure that those who have authorization to be able to access those crown jewels, or that their activity is very, very well accounted for. We call that data-centric defense.
Mr. Lonsberry, you might want to comment on what Mr. Castro said.
Thank you. I would agree with the spirit of what Mr. Castro says, but I think one of the essential pieces of this is that you make the best practices commonplace.
Sure.
I think that, everybody understands that there are issues about how you do secure development and engineering, things like threat analysis, threat mitigation, how you respond to those threat analysis through design, runtime protection techniques, vulnerability analysis, all those things in the development phase, and then you actually must extend those to the supply chain. But it can't be treated as a product-by-product activity. It has to be something you internalize to your company's processes in order to not have to do it every single time, that you can look to a provider and say, yes, we can deal with them and know their products are trustworthy.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Gett. All right. At this point, it appears our questions for the second panel are complete. And I guess... I want to thank the witnesses for coming today and for the testimony and members for their devotion to this hearing. The committee's rules provide that members have 10 days to submit additional questions for the record to the witness. And with that, the subcommittee is adjourned.